the violence intervention specialists, but they're specifically specialized responders that have specialized expertise on top of the violence intervention specialists, and they're able to go in as spot fire specialists and put out fires immediately, spot on, etc. A different degree of expertise. Most violence interrupters do evolve to the point of high-risk responders, but there is definitely a dividing line there. Okay, now once you got your people, you got your targeted population, you know what you're trying to do with your system, you know what people you're trying to look at, now you got to be able to place your people. Where are your people going to fit in terms of the overall system, in terms of what that looks like? This is where we utilize a process called the three-prong process. If you look at the top of that thing, prong one, these are the individuals that could stop the blood flow at all means. They're the ones that could stop the carnage in the street. My prong two people are my support team. They're the ones, once we stop the blood flow, they can come in and stabilize what we have stopped. What happens in most communities when you don't have a process like the three-prong process, you'll get your people on the ground that can stop the blood flow in the moment. But what do we see time and time again? We see retaliatorial engagement a month, 2 months, and 6 months down the line. That's because once we stopped and temporarily stabilized the individuals, we didn't anchor them. So when the triggers transpired again, they went back to the same process that they used before because they had no options and they had nothing to work with outside of what they had to work with when they were using the violence. So if you look at this, right, I'm not going to go deep here. I don't have time. To the column underneath the life-saving efforts tells you minimally what your people on the ground have to have. Not only do they have to have it, they need to be certified in all these areas. They need to minimally be able to do those 13 components within that box. Our prong two people are a little different. Usually they're specializing in 1 or 2 areas of what's on here. But again, back to your collaboration. Prong one is not more important than prong two. Prong two is not more important than prong one. Prong one usually leads to charge because we have to stop the fear factor in the community first. If the community is going to take ownership of the self, we have got to get them off the defensive. So prong one usually leads to charge. Prong one hands off to prong two. Prong two comes in and starts to stabilize the process, mental redirection, mental health, whatever's on board to need to get that person to stabilize. And then we look at the prong three process, which is now we're trying to really build the framework and the blueprint. This is where our hospitals, our philanthropy comes in. They're able to come and bring that level of support monetarily, et cetera, to keep the process going forward once we start the process. Okay. Now, I talked about training earlier, and what does that look like? Simplistically, your training process has to teach people rules and tools. It has to give them the skills on how to do the work, not only for themselves in terms of knowing what they're doing, but also to create the measure of accountability. The first thing I'm gonna ask when I step into a situation of an organization is doing this work, I'm gonna ask to see their protocol. I'm gonna ask to see their playbook. I'm gonna ask to see their manual of operation. I could tell just by those components what they're doing and what they're not doing. I don't need to see their work. Their work should be reflected in that overview of what I just mentioned. If you don't have that in front of me, I have a real problem with you because my thinking is you're operating off the cuff. You're operating off of your emotions. You're operating off of your relationships. You should be able to show me in the written format everything you do and qualify every move you make in the street. This stuff is not a game. And anybody that's in this work, if they think it's a game, they really need to take a look in the mirror and a wake-up call. My municipal people and the people that are supporting this work, you also need to understand the people on the ground, those of us that are doing this work correctly, we are professionals at what we do. That's why I told you this is not gang intervention work. This is comprehensive, community-led expertise that is dealing with the trauma, the crisis, and the violence in these given communities and have a mechanism to do that. So we have a process called talk through, walk through, run through. Training has to be what? Training has to be scenario based. It has to be where people have their hands in the work, to where they're doing the work, etc. Let me move away from here for the sake of time. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about scenario based. You need to be taking what's going on in the area of Pasadena and other areas, and you need to be building out the framework of how do we engage in these situations that are prevalent in the Pasadena arena. Now, if real education is going on board, you're going to be able to utilize these tools not only in Pasadena, but in areas that have similar circumstances, et cetera. So you create your scenarios, you build out a process, you train your people how to move, then you actually put them in the scenarios and make them go to work. Here's a scenario, prime example, gives them what they have to do. Brandon knows this well. He's been trained and trained well. He's an outstanding individual. I think I saw Flavio and Erica on the line. Same thing with them. I saw Ricky on the line. So this is the type of thing you go through. Then not only do you give them a situation, you also give them the geographic confines of that situation. How do you move? How do you place your people? What do you actually do? What is your protocol telling you? What is your process? Then you debrief this whole operation and bring in all the expertise to see if they did it right and make them go through a process to where they understand. Then they have to teach this information back, which really indicates if they understand actually what they're doing. Another scenario, same type, candlelight, visual, etc. Breakdown. Give them the scenario. This is what's happening. How do you arrange? How do you set up? How do you move? Who do you call? The whole gamut. Okay? Strategies and processes. Now look, I talked about this earlier. You've got to have a universal stratagem that is driving your process. This is what that out front, that in the moment, and that recovery looks like. Primary prevention, core intervention, tertiary deterrence, concentrating on the 4 areas below: people, place, behavior, weapons, making sure that we can engage those 4 areas through proper training, which is going to give us the capacity to be able to know what to do, how to do it, and have some semblance of simplicity in our mind that we can move forward. Okay, then we have to determine what are our risks in this whole process. Remember earlier, I talked about highest needs, highest behaviors. All of these things are working in contingent to get us to that level of professionalism that we know what we're doing and building out that toolbox. A couple of more slides and then I'm gonna wrap it. Professionals in this work got to be part of the public safety system. The public safety system has inherently certain anchors that the professionals have to know. The ICS system, which is a leadership command system, operational protocol, which dictate how we do what we do, a crisis response capacity to be able to instantaneously respond to those components that are off the chart, unified collaboration, having a collaborative and a partnership of individuals that can be allies and tools as you do the work you do, certified training, have to be able to show where individuals have went through a training process and truly have the skills to navigate these environments. And lastly, a playbook. What is my operational manual? What is that thing that drives how I'm gonna do this work? Okay. Real quickly, now on top of that, I talked about the system, the ICS system, and what that looks like from a public safety perspective. Then you have to have a process for engaging in actual crisis. What does that actual process look like? This is a process that we use. I'm not saying you have to use our process. I'm saying the first question I'm gonna ask you as a technical expert is, what is your process? How do you navigate crisis? How do you navigate violence, which is an endpoint in action, but that action was caused by something? How do you get to those root causes? How do you truly take a person and flip that person from a state of total destruction to a state of balance, equity, and the ability to engage in that environmental structure? This is one of our processes for crisis intervention, speaks to itself. Quite simply, we come in, we attempt to stabilize the situation and use all the mechanisms to do that. Then we move to mitigate the stress factors or those triggers which cause the imbalance. We'll move to mobilize and bring in the resources to meet needs and wants. And then we will help that individual problem solve as we problem solve to create the capacity to where they won't have to go back to that action again. This is something of your crisis, excuse me real quick. This is how your crisis response. I talked about a crisis response, but you got to have a crisis response mechanism. What warrants the people moving? What are the components of that system? What does that actual system look like? Here is a brief system, again, for the sake of time. I'm not going in detail, but I want you to at least see visually what these components look like, and more importantly, the comprehensiveness of this. Let me stop here and say this. I'm not attempting to oversaturate you, and the expectation is that you're going to have all these things up and running at all the same time. But what I do want you to inherently, clearly understand is you cannot build a system based on one, two, or three people and expect those people to be effective in doing this work of really stopping the carnage that's going on in your community. You have to create a much more inherently fluent system of resources, systems of collaborative partnerships, and systems that are driven by processes that everybody has agreed to and are working for. If you really want, at the end of the day, that reduction to happen and that carnage to stop, you have to really support the system and the people that you got working on the ground, as well as that support group. You have got to make sure you're behind them and they are getting the true type of resources, not only to save their own communities, but to save themselves from the vicarious trauma that they're having to go through every day when they deal with these traumatized situations. Real quick, I wanted to hit community public safety again, street outreach, violence interdiction, critical response, hospital engagement, outreach, which equates to lymphing, field training, which is important. And then at the end of the day, we have got to create some type of physical safe space or some type of safety hub that ends up being an end result. Pasadena, and I know Pasadena well, should have minimally 2 safety hubs in that city where people can go to for resilience, go to for refinement, go to learn, etc. Okay. I'm going to run through these last 3 sides. Your training components that you put in place, team, they need to do 3 things, and they need to work in 3 areas. Crisis intervention, life skills. You've got to teach your people these basics. Critical crisis interdiction, retaliatory protocol, peace agreement development, etc. Street mediation, rumor control, etc. All these are part of that. Number 1. Number 2, holistic healing, non-emergency trauma support. Your people have got to be trained in being able to navigate that trauma and reduce that trauma, bringing resiliency to so many of these people who are hurt in these communities and are using violence because of the simple fact that they want to ease that pain, and they're going to use anything, whether it's pro-social or whether it's anti-social, to ease some of that pain. And then lastly, sustainable community empowerment and partnerships. Once you create that stoppage team, you've got to bring in, as I said earlier, bring that community to the table. The community has to have a voice in the process. There has to be inclusion. If you do not include that community in the process, that community is going to become defensive and it's not going to integrate to any degree or lend any assistance. So they have to have a voice, as well as a voice to help change some of the policies, to help change some of the dynamics from a municipal structure, to help be a part of what that alteration actually looks like if they're truly going to have that ownership to make them feel that they're a part of that process. And I think I'm gonna stop there because I dropped a whole lot on you. Lastly, this slide is what we're ultimately going to. Having a safety hub in that community, having a hub that really acts at that point of resilience that starts to generate the safe spaces within these communities, to where now we create these safe spaces through these safety hubs, and we start linking these hubs together where people have that hope factor on board to know that true change can happen, and that there are people out there that are willing to help that change to action, and that community can deal with some of these issues of trauma, violence, and crisis in these neighborhoods through systematic approach, through strategic implementation, and through real template building in terms of processes that are validated and are going to get to real root causes at the end of the day to create that type of long-term anchored change that has to happen in these communities.